This morning, a chat with the legendary David Gilmour of Pink Floyd, the great British band that sold more than 200 million records. Well, he's formerly of Pink Floyd. That's over now. And he's just out with his first solo album in nearly 10 years.
For decades, the British band Pink Floyd rocked the entire globe with their fascinating sounds. And even though all members contributed equally to the group's success, none shone brighter than David Gilmour, one of rock's most gifted guitarists. But behind the music and the reputation is a story that is not all triumph.
I thought that we should gather together in a barn and just sort of jam and play some little musical ideas that I'd had for a few days while the band was still cooking. You know what it's like.
With a life marked by a kind of tragedy that doesn't always arrive in dramatic bursts, David's story is far from what it seems on the outside. It's deeply rooted in the slow erosion of friendship, in the silence after the death of someone who once shared the stage, and in the knowledge that the music you make can never bring them back. This is the tragedy of David Gilmour. Let's get into it. Early life. David John Gilmour was born on March 6, 1946, in Cambridge to his father, Douglas, a lecturer in zoology at the university, and his mother, Sylvia, a teacher and film editor. Surprisingly, they weren't exactly a musical family in the strict sense, but music was always there. Whether on the radio, in the records passed around at school, or even in the voices of his friends, there always seemed to be music around David. But what drew him in wasn't the roar of rock and roll, it was the sound of the guitar itself. At a young age, David taught himself to play with an obsession that set him apart from other boys his age. It really wasn't a feat expected of a young boy from 1950s Cambridge. Why? Because back then, it was academic, proper, and very self-contained. Not many people from there expressed themselves musically, and no one would have ever imagined a musical icon would rise from there. But in those quiet surroundings, David's inner world widened. He devoured American blues records, he watched the rise of the Beatles, he practiced until his fingers bled. Later, he would admit that he was never the most technically dazzling guitarist, but he found something more important: feel. The ability to make a guitar sing, not just play. By the early 1960s, David was already playing in local bands, scraping together gigs, dreaming of playing on the big stages. But he was never quite certain of what was possible. At one point, he even considered giving up on music. At the time, he'd been discouraged by how far away the dream of stardom felt. It was too out of reach for a young boy from Cambridge. It was too big a dream. So for a while, he gave up on his big stardom dreams, working odd jobs where he was barely making ends meet. But he still carried his guitar case everywhere like a lifeline. And even though he didn't believe it at the time, that lifeline would lead him to an extraordinary fate: joining Pink Floyd. In 1967, an experimental psychedelic band called Pink Floyd was beginning to gain attention in London. Their leader, Syd Barrett, was a childhood acquaintance of David's, also from Cambridge, and for a brief moment, it seemed like Syd would be the one to define British rock's new frontier, especially since Pink Floyd's early sound was built around his songwriting and surreal visions. But just as the band was on the rise, Syd began to unravel. The combination of LSD use and underlying mental illness made his behavior increasingly erratic. In the twinkle of an eye, the band's concerts became disasters. Syd would stand on stage, silent and unresponsive, or strum one chord endlessly. For a while, the rest of the band struggled to stay together. After all, Syd had been the backbone of the group, but as the months rolled by, they began to realize that they needed to choose between loyalty and survival. Realizing their band would fall off the face of the earth without help, the group members had no option but to reach out to David. In January of 1968, he joined Pink Floyd as a second guitarist, originally to support Syd. The idea was probably to cover for him until he recovered. But unfortunately, Syd never recovered. By April, he was gone from the band entirely. And just like that, the weight of carrying Pink Floyd forward fell heavily on David's shoulders. It was not the way one dreams of joining a band. For David, the transition was haunted. He had to replace a friend, someone he had once admired, knowing that the replacement was born out of tragedy. Unfortunately for him, this would become a theme in his life: to step in quietly, to hold the pieces together after someone else's fall. Yet there was a silver lining. because from that pain came something extraordinary. David's guitar became the band's new voice. It was expansive, emotional, filled with space and longing. Gone was the man simply filling space for Sid. Here was a man creating an entirely new landscape of sound. Songs like Echoes, Shine on You Crazy Diamond, and later Comfortably Numb were built around his soaring, aching solos. In the twinkle of an eye, Pink Floyd transformed from a cult psychedelic act into one of the most successful and influential bands in the world. But even in the height of success, Sid's shadow somehow still lingered. David never forgot the boy he had known, the friend he had replaced, the genius undone by fragility. It was a silent tragedy that would sit inside the music for decades, because every time he strung his guitar, you could almost hear the echo of someone missing. The rise of Floyd. In the years after Sid's departure, something almost miraculous happened. What could have been the end of Pink Floyd became its rebirth. With David stepping in, the band shifted from whimsical psychedelia into deeper, darker explorations of sound and human experience. It wasn't instant, though. For a while they drifted, unsure of what shape they would take without Sid's vision. But David's guitar gave them a new center of gravity. His style was unlike anyone else's, never rushed, never overfilled. Just a few notes stretched until they seemed to open a doorway inside you. By the early 1970s, albums like Metal and The Dark Side of the Moon had changed the landscape of music itself. Dark Side in 1973 wasn't just an album, it was a meditation on madness, time, death, and the pressures of modern life. It spent more than a decade on the charts. It's a record that remains staggering even now, and through it all, David's guitar lines soared, mournful, defiant, endlessly human. It is strange, and almost cruel, how often tragedy breeds timeless art. The pain of losing Syd Barrett was woven into Wish You Were Here in 1975 with a title track that aches with absence. Then there was also Shine on You Crazy Diamond, which was written directly for him, almost like a love letter and a eulogy for a friend who was still alive, but unreachable. David once said that when Syd unexpectedly turned up at the studio during the recording sessions, overweight with shaved eyebrows and head, the band barely recognized him. David was shaken, seeing the friend he had replaced, standing silently in the studio, broken and altered, was like looking at a ghost. It was one of those moments that never left him. The weight of Syd's decline. Many say that this was the first real tragedy of David's life, and in many ways, it defined all the others that followed. He not only had to deal with the loss of a friend, but he also had to live with the guilt of replacing said friend. It's a kind of grief that doesn't announce itself with death, but with disappearance. That was Syd, alive, but lost. And David carried that grief for decades. Whenever he played Shine on You Crazy Diamond, you could hear it in the bends of his notes. The sound of reaching for someone already gone. It wasn't melodrama. It was memory pressed into music. Fans sometimes speak of Syd's fall as Pink Floyd's great wound, but for David, it was personal. He was the one who had to sing the songs Syd could no longer sing, to play the solos Syd never would, to live the life his friend had been meant to. And when the world applauded, when the crowds roared for Pink Floyd's triumphs, he was haunted by the cost of that triumph. But even as fame consumed them, Pink Floyd was never a band at ease. Success magnified their differences. And this was where the tensions between David and Roger Waters began to brew. Tensions with Roger. Roger became the dominant songwriter, often steering the group into concept albums filled with rage at politics and society. David, more gentle by nature, poured himself into melody, into finding the emotional core of songs. Together they created Animals and The Wall, records that reshaped rock into art theater. But the personal cost was growing. David's voice and guitar were central to Comfortably Numb, one of the band's most iconic pieces, but the tensions with Roger made the studio feel much like a battlefield. Pink Floyd's rise in the 70s was built on the tension between Roger's biting intellectual vision and David's lyrical, emotional voice. Together, they made music that was both head and heart, fury and tenderness. But that tension was always fragile. By the time of The Wall in '79, cracks had become canyons. Roger saw himself as the architect, the one who carried the band's grand concepts, while David, who poured life into the music with his voice and guitar, felt increasingly sidelined. Recording sessions soon turned bitter, and arguments replaced collaboration. The breaking point came in the early 80s when Roger tried to dissolve Pink Floyd altogether. Fortunately, David and Nick resisted. What followed was a long and public legal battle over the band's name, rights, and legacy. For the rest of the band members, this wasn't just business, it felt like betrayal. To this day, fans debate who was right. Roger insists he was protecting his artistic vision, and David insists that the music was never his alone to dictate. What's clear is that both men carried deep hurt from the split, and neither was ever able to forgive fully. For years, their public comments about each other were laced with disdain. Roger criticized David's leadership, calling his songs shallow. David, normally restrained, admitted he had no interest in working with Roger again. It was a feud that aged badly. Unlike the fiery breakups of other bands, which sometimes cooled with time, this one seemed only to deepen. Every attempted reconciliation ended in fresh wounds. Even their children, at times, were drawn into the crossfire on social media, proof that the bitterness had seeped far beyond music. And yet, there were moments when hope flickered. In 2005, Pink Floyd reunited for a brief, historic performance at Live 8. The sight of Roger and David standing side by side after decades apart brought tears to fans around the world. For a moment, it seemed like old wounds might heal, but the reunion was fleeting. In the years that followed, David remained reluctant. He felt that the band had already said what it needed to say, and that revisiting it without Richard would be hollow. Roger, meanwhile, continued to hint at reunions, only to be met with David's silence. When Richard passed, the final nail seemed driven in as David declared that without Richard, there could be no true Pink Floyd reunion. And yet the feud still lingered, because what was lost was not just a band, it was a friendship that had curdled into something unrecognizable. But the trouble with the band wasn't David's only heartbreak, because while he was struggling to keep the band alive, his personal life was completely falling apart. Love, refuge, and the cost of intimacy. For all the noise and spectacle of Pink Floyd, David's private life was often quiet, even fragile. He was not the wild rock star archetype people might imagine. Neither did he thrive on chaos. Instead, he seemed to long for sanctuary, for a place where the storms of music and fame could not reach him. In 1975, at the height of Floyd's success, he married Virginia Ginger Hazenbein, an American model. They had 4 children together, and for a while the contrast between home and stage gave him balance. But balance is not always easy to maintain, especially when the world wants more of you than you have to give. The pressures of fame, relentless touring, and the internal battles within Floyd strained everything. By the early 1990s, David and Ginger had separated, and the marriage ended in divorce. For someone like David, who craved stability, this was no small heartbreak. The man who could hold millions silent with a single guitar note now found silence inside his own home. Yet out of that ending came another beginning. In '94, David married novelist and lyricist Polly Sampson, a union that reshaped not only his personal life but also his music. Polly wasn't just a partner in love but also in art. She co-wrote lyrics for Pink Floyd's The Division Bell and later contributed heavily to his solo projects. Their relationship became a creative anchor, a rare example of how personal love could fuse with professional collaboration in a way that strengthened both. With Polly, David found the stability he had once been searching for. Together, they had 4 children, adding to his earlier family, making him the father of 8. Fatherhood softened the legend. To his children, he wasn't the mythic guitarist of Dark Side of the Moon. He was simply Dad. And yet, even in this sanctuary, tragedy lingered at the edges. One of his sons, Charlie, was jailed in 2011 for violent disorder during student protests in London. It was a painful episode for the family, thrust into headlines they hadn't asked for. Polly's presence, though, seemed to help him weather these storms. She was by his side in interviews, in the writing process, and in the smallest details of life. Their partnership was deeply visible on Rattle That Lock in 2015, and most recently on Luck and Strange, his 2024 album filled with his reflections on age, mortality, and gratitude. Many of the lyrics are hers, words she shaped but he carried with his voice and guitar. In that way, their marriage was more than love. It was collaboration turned into permanence. But unfortunately, the peace David found with Polly wasn't enough to stop the tragedies he had to endure. Richard Wright, The Quiet Bond. If Sid's collapse was the first tragedy of David's life in Pink Floyd, the death of Richard Wright was the one that cut deepest. Richard, the band's keyboardist and co-founder, was the quiet heart of Floyd. He didn't fight for the spotlight, didn't wrestle for control, but his playing was the glue that held their vast soundscapes together. David often described Richard as his closest musical companion within the band. While Roger and he clashed in vision and ego, Richard shared his instinct for space, for melody, for allowing music to breathe. When David's guitar soared, it was often Richard's chords, drifting like clouds, that carried it upward. The chemistry between them wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. So when Richard died of cancer in September 2008, David was shaken. It wasn't just the death of a colleague. It was the death of the one person inside Pink Floyd who had always understood his language without words. In interviews following Richard's death, David spoke with rare openness. He called Richard irreplaceable, not just in the band, but in his life. Imagine playing with someone for so long that your instruments begin to finish each other's sentences. That's what David and Richard had. And when the latter was gone, the silence was deafening. Fans often talk about the great feuds of Pink Floyd, the endless battles between Roger and David, the lawsuits, the bitterness. But in truth, the more important story is this, that the quietest member of the band, Richard, was the one who made David feel less alone in the chaos. And his death left David exposed, musically and emotionally. Perhaps the most heartbreaking symbol of this loss is The Endless River, the final Pink Floyd album released in 2014. It was built from unused recordings of Richard, fragments of keyboard passages from old sessions. David and drummer Nick Mason shaped them into an ambient farewell, a posthumous collaboration with a man who could no longer sit in the studio. David said making the album felt like a way of saying goodbye. But even then, it was incomplete. No amount of piecing together old tapes could bring back the living dialogue they once shared. The Endless River wasn't really a Pink Floyd record. It was a memorial. And that's what makes it so piercing. The great band that had sold hundreds of millions of albums, filled stadiums, and defined a generation ended not with a bang, but with the ghostly echoes of a friend's playing, held together by David's grief. But if Richard's death was the loss of a partner, then the feud with Roger was the loss of a brother. At 79, David still carries this as part of his story. He doesn't carry himself like a rock star. Instead, when he walks out today with his guitar, the stage feels stripped down, bare, almost fragile. It is the music that does the talking, and the man who plays it now feels closer to the David who was once just a boy in Cambridge picking up a guitar under gray English skies. A lifetime has passed. The band that made him immortal no longer exists. Sid is gone, Rick is gone, and Roger is estranged. Even Nick, the last partner still in touch, has his own distance. What remains are the songs and the memories stitched into every chord. What are your thoughts on David's life? Tell us in the comments. Thanks for watching. Please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this.